You want to grab that mic for me?
Oh. I could yell.
That mic.
Hey, you all. Testing.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. We're continuing a series in which we're talking about examples where stepmoms and stepkids, meaning not the kids of the stepmom, but I think you know what I mean, how they represent a disproportionately large part of all the conflict that happens in probate court. This is a somewhat unknown reality, but it's a fact that in part because we have now a lot more marriages that are blended, but also because the difference in lifespan. I mean, we know that women live longer, and when you look at just that last 15 years, though it's not a huge number of years in and of itself, it represents a large fraction of the older people beyond 80, for example, that are alive. So the result is that you have kids who are the biological children of the deceased husband. So it's not so much a conversation about step-parents and step-kids. To be more specific, and the reason we launched this series is to talk about the fact that it's really about one group that occupies 80% of the discussion, maybe 85% of the discussion. So we thought, let's look for examples where we can learn something. Now, the example we're looking at today is not a especially horrific or a shocking example of how things can go wrong, but it is an example. But I think more important here are a variety of other factors. This is, of course, as typically is the case, somebody you'll know. And it's somebody who made some mistakes in estate planning, did some things right. We don't just focus on people that get it wrong. We focus on people that get it right as well. So with that said, let's turn to Marley, who very faithfully researches these topics and makes the selections typically unilaterally of the shows we're doing. So the people you don't like, But anyway, still, Marley is wonderful at this role, and you selected this person today. Tell us why and a little bit about the person.
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about Glen Campbell. So you're all probably familiar with the name. You all probably know some of his music. He is a legendary country musician and guitarist. He has released over 70 albums, sold more than 45 million records worldwide, and has earned, numerous awards. He was in a session band for lots of very famous songs that, he didn't write himself or sing himself, but the name is very well known. One way or another, you've probably seen it somewhere.
Yeah.
But we picked him today just because he has a couple of different marriages, lots of kids, and a pretty well-known legacy. So.
Yeah, much beloved. Glen Campbell is much beloved, more than most musicians. I don't know what it is that causes some musicians to have people feel a bond with them that's unique and special. I don't think it's simply a function of talent. It's far more than that. I think Elvis Presley had that bond with people. Yes, he was talented, and yes, he had a lot of people who just liked his music, but there's something about his personality, his warmth, that really resonated with people. And as a result, he has people who feel like he's a relative of the family, who mourned him as if he were a family member. Glen Campbell, not to that degree, but Glen Campbell is in that category. And a lot of people aren't. I mean, if you think about, I won't give examples because some of you may feel some affection for some of these people, but we can think about the many stars that pass away over a given year, and how many of them will have that quality, even if they're very talented. So this isn't a function of someone's achievement. It's more than that. And Glen Campbell, of course, he died of Alzheimer's. We'll talk a little bit about those last years because it does relate to the estate planning. But he really tugged at the heartstrings of America in the latter years. But I would argue he had that relationship his entire career. All right, Marley. So tell us about his early life and early career.
Yeah, so he was born in April 1936 in Arkansas, near Delight, Arkansas. I believe the town that he was actually born in is called Billstown, but it's teeny tiny. And he was born to John and Carrie Campbell. And they are a very, very, very poor family. They had 12 kids and they were farmers.
They were
So,
cotton sharecroppers, weren't they?
yes, cotton farmers. They did a couple of other things like corn, watermelons, and potatoes, but mainly cotton farmers. And I mean, he grew up working very, very hard. He definitely knew hard work. His parents, from the age of like, I believe when he could pretty much walk, they were having him work. And he remembers that he picked cotton for, I believe it was like $1.25 per 100 pounds. And he was like, if you worked really hard, you could get through 80 or 90 pounds a day, which is that's absolutely crazy to me that
Yeah.
they were working for that.
And that was
But
at a time when, the agrarian societies had children for purposes of a workforce. So, I
mhm.
mean, large families weren't a cost. Instead, they were a means of increasing family income. Eventually, you invest in the early years, but you quickly put them to work. And as you suggested, often you'll have a 4-year-old kid who can do some things on a farm.
Yeah. But I mean, it made the family really, really close. They were all super musically inclined, and he started off actually playing the guitar at age 4 also. It was a gift from his father. His first guitar was from Sears.
Sears Roebuck.
Yes, and I believe it was only like $5. And his uncle started teaching him the basics of how to play. And by the age of 6, he was performing on local radio stations.
Yeah, how many people became great guitarists on Sears Roebuck guitars? Justin, that would be worthy of some research.
This is true. Mine was a pawn shop, personally, but
Well, yeah, pawn
that's
shops.
probably number 2.
Yeah, yeah, and the thing about it is that Sears and Roebuck made a pretty decent guitar. I mean, it wasn't a Gibson, it wasn't a Fender, but it was a decent guitar. And actually, Justin, you don't know this about me. I had a Sears Roebuck guitar as a child. I wouldn't be on that list of great guitarists who started out with Sears, but I can appreciate the fact that they were affordable at the time, and they weren't that bad as cheap guitars go. But so Sears did a lot of things right. We'll do a show on that sometime, maybe. So he somehow becomes very proficient at guitar pretty early.
So he developed his talent by listening to the radio, and he loved Django Reinhardt, I believe. And he would play like alongside the radio when his songs were on, and that's how he learned. He didn't ever learn how to read music. I don't think he ever did, even later on, for most of the instruments that he played. And he could just pick it up by ear, which is what, as we'll see, like it makes him a great session artist because that's one of the main things that they need. But he did drop out of school in the 10th grade at age 14, and he moved to Houston with some of his brothers, and they worked in insulation, and they worked at a gas station as well. But he wasn't in love with that. I think he kind of recognized his talent at a young age, obviously, and so did a lot of his family members. So he started playing at fairs and church and just kind of different local radio stations, nightclubs, things like that to kind of get his name out there.
Yeah, he did. I don't mean to keep interrupting you, but it is interesting that he got radio stations to play him pretty early. And what I'm imagining is the case is that he was originally in a small town, so they're looking for airtime to fill. And when they're not simply playing records or something, they do look for live shows locally. And that was a thing. Those of you who are old enough to know that, remember it. But he managed, through probably not a great deal of good fortune, to get on several radio stations. And he would come on and play and fill a slot periodically. And I don't know if he continued doing that. He could, as you point out, he continued. Matter of fact, his opportunities to perform grew when they moved to Houston.
Yes, yeah. And then I grew even farther at age 17, and I believe it was 1954. He moved to New Mexico, and that was to join his uncle's band, known as, I believe it was the Sandia Mountain Boys. And there he kind of learned, like what that life looks like, and he kind of recognized, like, oh, this is what I want. And then in 58, he formed his own band called the Western Wranglers, and they worked super hard. They weren't super well known, but they did, play a couple of bigger shows and stuff like that. But I think from there, he kind of decided, oh, I want to go, this solo career, and he moved to Los Angeles in 1960.
And that was when, shortly thereafter, he started working as a studio musician.
Yes, that's correct.
They call him a session artist.
Yes. Yeah. He had a daytime job at a publishing company, and then he was writing songs there and recording demos and everything like that. And then he worked with the Wrecking Crew as well for his studio musician group. And the Wrecking Crew is very well known. I don't think I'll be able to talk about them as much as you, Joe, but
yeah, I guess that not many people your age, unless they've read a lot about some of the music they listen to, even today, that they wouldn't know of this group. But people in the industry knew the quote unquote the Wrecking Crew, and that's WRECK, the Wrecking Crew. And it was there were, I think, 7 or 8 musicians. Some came and went, so the composition changed a little bit. But there were some very great names, and if I name those names, I'm pretty confident, unless you're an insider in the industry, you're not going to know these names. But Justin, you would know them, and they're people though who were musicians, meaning that they're the ones that the guitarists you like that perform in bands, they often look up to these guys and gals in some case. There's a lady who was a bass player, I forget her name, and she was
Carol Kay.
Carol Kay. And she was famous. I mean, she was very respected as a bass player.
There's a documentary that came out in 2008 that I highly recommend. It's called The Wrecking Crew, but yeah.
It's on YouTube?
I don't believe so, but it's on most streaming services.
Okay. And it's really interesting to watch. We won't get too far off track here to talk about this, but it is talking about Glen Campbell. And as you point out, it's interesting that many of the people who were in the Wrecking Crew, not all of them, but I suspect half of them did not read music. And the reason that worked is that the skills they acquired over the course of their learning to play required that they develop an ear, that they be able to listen to a record, which they would have had access to at that time, or other recordings, and they to be able to replicate it. And much of it was the radio, which if you're real poor, it was just the radio, which means, you're getting an occasional opportunity to hear a song, and then you have to remember it well enough to try to recreate it. So the people who were good at that were people who had this ear and this capability of imagining sound and recreating it. So this whole generation of guitarists, especially guitarists more than anybody else, the pianists, they were learning by sheet music. Those great rock pianists were people who learned to read music, but not so of the early great rock guitarists. Very few, is the exception, that could read music. So they were great in part because they developed these skills of listening, and it gave them a versatility and a familiarity that allowed them to walk into a studio on any given morning. And if you look at some of the songs that the Wrecking Crew did, if you look at the variety of sound, I mean, that's the point, is that it was never the same. You didn't know on a given day what you might be doing. Here's an example of, if you listen to these songs and you think, wow, the music in the background is really good, which if you listen to it, you should be of that opinion, then this is all the Wrecking Crew that did these songs. I'm not saying Glen Campbell was on all of them. I suspect he's probably on most of these. Good Vibration, the Beach Boys. Be My Baby, the Ronettes. These Boots Are Made for Walking, Nancy Sinatra. And incidentally, he also recorded a number of songs with Frank Sinatra, believe it or not. And that shows you the diverse skills that he has and the breadth of his style capabilities. Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds, You've Lost That Lovin' Feeling, the Righteous Brothers, what a classic. Bridge Over Troubled Water, Simon and Garfunkel. I cannot imagine Glen Campbell on Bridge Over Troubled Water, but when you listen to it, you're listening to the Wrecking Crew, and he was playing there. Bridge Over Troubled Water, California Dreamin', Mamas and Papas. I Got You, Babe, Sonny and Cher. Of course, Wichita Lineman. We all know Glen Campbell from that. Pet Sounds, which was the album. Some would say the best album by the Beach Boys. These are just a few. I mean, there are 100+ songs that, at least, that are noted songs that were recorded by the Wrecking Crew as the session artists. Anyway, I wanted to dwell on that to tell you about the Wrecking Crew, but more importantly, to really call attention to the fact that Glen Campbell was an incredible guitarist. And some people think he was just this rhinestone cowboy, meaning this nice-looking guy who had a great voice and would strum a guitar. But yeah, he was a nice-looking guy, had a great voice, but he was just an incredible guitarist. And you can find lots of recordings where he does solos in performances that are just really fast. He does a Western style picking often, not always. Sometimes you'll find him on a rock tune that's recorded. Those are less common. Most of that's going to appear with the Wrecking Crew. A good video to watch that will give you a sense of his capabilities is he and Roy Clark did several things together over the years, and I think one might have been on Hee Haw, the show. But if you go on YouTube and just put in Glen Campbell guitar and maybe a Roy Clark also, and you'll see them playing together. Both great guitarists, but many people just do not appreciate how incredibly talented Glen Campbell was. And he didn't really become famous because of his guitar skills. That's what's interesting is that usually you think of someone, their primary ability is what they become known for as a musician. But that's not really true. I would argue that as great as Glen Campbell's voice was, I think he would have been if he had just focused on being a guitarist, I think he could have been even as much or more famous. Now, he was given some really great songs, and we'll talk about that. That. We can't shortchange that because he happened to run into somebody who was a master as a songwriter, and this partnership produced what, in fairness, has to be among the most remembered, appreciated, I would even use the word moving songs of that generation, of that era. And some are thinking, well, that's kind of hyperbole. Yeah, why don't you talk about when Glen Campbell came together with Jimmy Webb, and which resulted in these several great hits.
Yeah, so before Campbell met Jimmy Webb, he was kind of failing in the singles department. He had released a couple of different ones with Capitol Records, but it wasn't going well. So they paired him with the producer Al DeLore and the songwriter Jimmy Webb, and from them came some of his greatest hits, like Wichita Lineman, Galveston, By the Time I Get to Phoenix. And these were songs that were charting, in the top 100s for the Billboard. And he was nominated for multiple awards. He won Grammy Awards for By the Time I Get to Phoenix, and just all kinds of things. But these songs are what he is really well known for. And a lot of it he credits Jimmy Webb with because he was the songwriter for them and he brought them to life.
Yeah. They're kind of indebted to each other. I mean, Wichita Lineman, those of anyone who hasn't listened to those lyrics, I mean, it's really a real moving song, and it creates this picture, and that whole idea of this guy on a pole, a rural area in Texas, it just it's a real moving sort of subject matter. And also Galveston was a song that a lot of people didn't fully appreciate. It's about a guy that is going off to war or is at war and misses his home. It's just a great song. I mean, those, By the Time We Get to Phoenix, a good song. But I guess if we were to say what is Glen Campbell most remembered for, it's probably those three songs more than the other. He had I think a couple of more number one hits in the 70s.
I would say like Rhinestone Cowboy is
Oh, yeah.
probably one that like people pick up on most, but
Yeah.
Wichita Lineman charted at like number 3, I believe, on the Billboard Top 100.
That's interesting. I would have thought
And
that
that
was
was,
one.
yeah, that was for about like 15 weeks that it charted, but
An incredible song. Um,
mhm.
and then what were his hits in the 70s or later in the 70s?
He had like Rhinestone Cowboy, Southern Nights, and Sunflower. I forgot
Okay.
about Sun.
So he had, I don't know how many Grammy Awards. Do we know?
He had 4, and then he got nominated for a lot more though.
Yeah. So he also took a run at acting, and he was in True Grit, right, with John Wayne.
And yep.
Now, I will say this. I don't think that he had a lot of potential in that department.
No,
Yeah.
no. He was nominated for a Golden Globe,
I was a little
but that
surprised to read that.
because of like the song True Grit. That I don't think that was
Oh,
necessarily all because of the movie,
or
but
his
I think
acting in it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So, an incredible talent, just an
Mhm.
incredible talent. So he married how many times? And tell us about his kids.
Yeah, so he married 4 times. His first wife was Diane Clark. They married in 1955, and she was 16 and he was 18, I believe. And they got divorced in 1959. And we'll kind of see very similar to a lot of other people that we cover here. A lot of these marriages overlap or are in the same year as the divorce and so on. But with Diane, he had 2 kids, Glenn Travis Campbell Jr., who actually was born premature and died, I believe, 5 weeks later, and then Debbie Campbell. And then from there, he went on to marry Billie Jean Nunley, and they were married from 1959. So there's an overlap to 1976. She was the mother of Kelly Campbell, William Travis Campbell, and Wesley Kane Campbell. And then he went on to marry Sarah Barg, who was the 3rd wife. And there's another overlap here. They were married from 1976 to 1980, and she's the mother of Dylan Campbell. And then his 4th and final wife, Kimberly Woolen, they were married from 1982 up until his death in 2017. And she was the mother of Cal, Shannon, and Ashley Campbell. And when he married her, when Glenn married Kimberly, he was like, this is what I've been looking for all my life. He was very secure in their marriage. His other ones, he had been married really young, or he was just going through a lot in his career. But when he met Kimberly, she kind of pulled him out of a bit of like drug and alcohol abuse that he was starting in. And she kind of like set his life back on track and helped him with everything. I don't think his kids, like his other kids, liked her too much, and we'll kind of get into this, but they had their moms and she had her own kids, and I think it was not necessarily a family divided, but they weren't really heavily involved in everybody else's lives at that point.
Yeah, and this is another example which we see a lot of people who go through several marriages and have kids from several marriages, which sets the stage for a lot of conflict. I mean, a blended family is one thing. It's probably the norm in America today, which is kind of the underlying demo that results in kind of the topic of this series. But it's a different thing when there are multiple marriages and multiple kids from each marriage. In this case, there were a total of 9 kids, I think. And the
Yes.
one that passed away would
Yes,
make it
so a
8.
total of 8 children, yeah,
Yeah,
that are
8 that
alive.
survived when he passed away. Correct? Okay,
Yes.
so it was also compounded by another familiar component to those of you who watch this show, is that there was drug and alcohol problems with Glenn, and it probably came to the fore primarily in the 70s, but he had drank a lot throughout his adulthood, and it might have, we can speculate, to what extent would he have had greater success if that factor wasn't there. it didn't really grab hold of him in a way that jeopardized his career until the 70s, and it'd be the latter half of the 70s and then going into the 80s. So the drug and alcohol problems did consume a lot of money, as well as, undermined relationships, consumed relationships essentially with children and spouses and ex-spouses. And so there's that effect that's difficult to quantify. But the financial effect we know is real. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But he went through a really low period before he went into drug rehab and before his last wife, Kim, kind of gained influence over his life and was a very positive influence in many ways, and was certainly influential in his deciding to go into treatment. He was in the Betty Ford Center, I think, for a month or so in the early 80s. So he did realize he had a problem, but prior to that, it was wild, I'm sure. When you have Tanya Tucker involved, he never married Tanya Tucker, but she was, at the time he was 46, and I think she was 20 or something, or she's in her 20s. And she was wild and crazy, and definitely not a good influence on him. I like Tanya Tucker. I like some of the songs that she's had hits with, but it's just a fact that some say, and I don't know if this is true, but it's been reported that she's the one who really introduced him to cocaine, that he already had a drug problem and traditional prescription drug problem, but he had never used quote-unquote illegal drugs like cocaine. So there may or may not be some truth to it, but I tend to believe that would be the case. So he was with her for a couple of years that were really crazy and very destructive for him, and I'm sure for her too. But he ended up marrying. He goes into treatment, and he gets his career back on track by mid 80s, I would say.
Yes.
Thereafter, he continued to perform and record, right?
Yeah, he did continue to perform and record up until his Alzheimer's diagnosis. And then once he had that was in 2010, I believe. And once he found out he had Alzheimer's, he did like a final tour, and he did a couple more album recordings. And he just kind of knew that, it was coming to an end and he wasn't going to be able to do it for much longer. But he did album recordings all the way through 2012, I believe. And then his last album came out a couple of years after that, but it was before his death.
Yeah. And his wife, Kim, was really, I think, largely the moving force behind his doing that last tour. And many of you may have seen clips from that. When I first heard it was coming off, I was wondering, is this going to be a tasteful thing? Because he was fairly advanced at that stage. But there's something amazing about people with Alzheimer's. And I guess the way the brain works generally is, whether it's Alzheimer's or something else, is it's very compartmentalized, and he had this ability to remember music far past when he could remember people and conversations, and eventually it would affect the music too. But the fact that he could go on a stage and play and pull it off was really amazing. So it was kind of a goodbye tour, but it didn't turn out to be this thing that could be kind of cheesy or in poor taste. I don't know.
Yeah, not even like anything like somber or anything like that. It was truly just I think he just really wanted to go out and play music again. And he did very well, like you said, on this tour. It wasn't anything that was hokey or trying to bring it back or anything like that. Yeah.
It was handled very tastefully, and I'm sure it made some money, which he needed, certainly wanted, and may have needed. We'll talk about that. So there was some income coming in, and it was probably healthy for him, quite frankly, to be engaged in that way and to do that tour. And it was very popular, the tour was. All the venues were sold out, and the crowd was very adoring, and they understood this is a goodbye tour, essentially. But it wasn't cheesy or modeling. So I was very impressed with how well it's done, and I wasn't sure at the outset that it would come off that way. But, it certainly did. It was successful. So let's talk a little bit about the estate planning. Glen Campbell, we know he continued to have relationships, positive relationships for the most part with his kids. There were 3 kids that we don't know the details, but there must have been quite a breach. And I suspect that breach has something to do with the kids' relationships with their biological mother and their lack of a relationship with the stepmom. We don't know the details of all that, but the kids weren't invited to the funeral, and there was a breach that really dated back to the decision to marry the last time. So I think Glen Campbell, though, did struggle more than some, and he succeeded more than many in having a relationship with his kids that, despite the handicaps of a career in which he traveled, despite the handicaps of several additional wives, and remember these would be kids with previous marriages, and despite the fact that he had a drug and alcohol problem. So you throw those in, and it's a perfect recipe for having no relationship with your kids. So we're going to break this episode into 2 parts. So today was part 1. So join us again for Life's Third Act regarding the life and estate of Glen Campbell for part 2. See you next time.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.